Every Thursday at exactly 3:30 p.m., Keanu Reeves's Maid vanished without explanation, until one stormy afternoon he followed her. What he uncovered in a crumbling alley wasn't just shocking, it forced him to question everything he thought he knew about purpose, dignity, and human potential. What was she hiding, and why did it change his life forever? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain had come early that Thursday, drifting in from the ocean with a quiet, relentless rhythm. Keanu Reeves stood by the large glass doors of his Los Angeles home, holding a cup of untouched tea. The sound of droplets tapping the terrace roof had always soothed him, but today something else pressed on his mind. Not an interview, not a script. Rosa. She was in the hallway, tying her scarf with the same gentle precision she used to fold the laundry. Rosa Mendoza. 61 years old, 5 feet tall, always in muted sweaters. She had worked in Keanu's home for nearly a year, and never once had she asked for anything. Except this one thing. Every Thursday, at exactly 3:30 p.m., she would approach him with the same soft voice and steady eyes. "Senor Reeves, would it be all right if I left a little early today?" At first, he'd assumed it was a recurring appointment, a doctor perhaps, or maybe a family obligation. But now, 52 Thursdays later, it wasn't just a pattern. It had become a mystery. Today, for reasons he didn't fully understand, Keanu found himself watching her more closely. She wore the same light blue jacket, the same worn brown leather shoes. She never lingered, never gave details. And she always left just before the skies turned gold. "Of course, Rosa," he said, just like always. But this time, as she turned and walked away, something shifted. He didn't go back to his office, he didn't rehearse his lines. He stood by the window and watched her walk down the stone path toward the gate, clutching her umbrella close. The security team had been told not to bother her on Thursdays. She waved politely to the front guard as she passed, just as she always did. Keanu set his tea on the windowsill, grabbed his keys, and left through the side entrance. It wasn't suspicion pulling at him. It was something else. A quiet intuition, a feeling in his chest that told him there was more to Rosa than he had ever known. And if it was something that mattered to her every single Thursday, maybe it was time he understood why. He got into his modest black sedan, the one nobody recognized, and slowly pulled out of the driveway, careful to stay several cars behind. Rosa was already at the corner, walking briskly despite the drizzle, her small frame moving with determination. She boarded the number 12 bus without looking back. Keanu followed. Keanu eased his car into traffic, staying far enough back to avoid being seen. The rain made visibility hazy, but he could still make out Rosa's silhouette through the bus's side windows. He didn't know what he expected to find. He only knew he had to understand where she went, and why. The number 12 bus turned off Sunset and dipped into the older neighborhoods east of downtown. It passed strip malls and weathered apartment complexes, then curved onto a quieter street lined with chain-link fences and rusted mailboxes. 20 minutes in, Rosa pulled the stop cord. Keanu's pulse picked up. He parked a block behind and watched as she stepped off the bus, adjusted her scarf, and walked with purpose down a cracked sidewalk. She passed 2 boarded-up storefronts, then turned between 2 buildings that looked abandoned from the front. Keanu left his car and followed on foot. He hesitated before reaching the alley, unsure of whether he was crossing a line. But something about her movement, her posture, her urgency, compelled him forward. The alley opened into a narrow courtyard, wedged between 2 aging apartment blocks. Faint voices echoed through the air. Laughter. Music. Then he saw her. Rosa stood at the far end, pushing open a chain-link gate marked with a handmade wooden sign. The paint had faded, but the words were still clear. La Casita de Esperanza, the little house of hope. Keanu stopped in his tracks. Beyond the gate was something he hadn't expected. Not a shelter, not a clinic. It was a school, or something like it. Colorful murals covered the brick walls. There were long tables stacked with books, bins filled with musical instruments, and shelves holding art supplies. Inside, a dozen children sat cross-legged on a rug, while Rosa unpacked her bag. She wasn't cleaning, she wasn't cooking. She was teaching. Keanu stood frozen under the awning of the building next door, watching as Rosa knelt beside a boy who was struggling with a book. She spoke to him gently, patiently, pointing at the page until he smiled and began reading aloud. Another child tapped her on the shoulder and asked for help with his drawing. Rosa laughed softly, then rolled up her sleeves and moved between the children with practiced ease. Her whole demeanor had changed. The quiet, reserved woman who barely spoke in his house had transformed into someone radiant, someone in control, someone essential. And Keanu realized, in that moment, that he had never really known her at all. Keanu remained still, the rain misting against his jacket as the world inside La Casita de Esperanza unfolded like a secret story he was never meant to read. A small girl danced between the tables with red paint streaked on her cheeks, showing off a paper heart she had made. A boy strummed a slightly out-of-tune guitar in the corner, his legs swinging beneath the chair. No one looked bored. No one looked afraid. It wasn't just a safe space, it was a sacred one. Rosa moved through the room with a quiet authority, wiping paint from fingers, retying loose ponytails, kneeling to meet a child's eye level when they whispered questions too softly for others to hear. She laughed, easily, not like she ever did at Keanu's mansion, where her words were brief, careful, always respectful. Here, she was someone else entirely. Or maybe, this was who she had always been. A door creaked open from the back of the room, and an older woman stepped in carrying a tray of sandwiches. Rosa greeted her like an old friend. The children swarmed toward the food with a practiced rhythm, cleaning their hands and forming a line. No adult had to raise a voice. The rules here seemed unwritten, but deeply respected. Keanu's hands were cold now, but he didn't move. He was watching something too rare to interrupt. A moment later, Rosa sat on a short stool and began reading from a book in Spanish. The children hushed immediately. Her voice was warm and animated. Every few lines she stopped to ask a question or to explain a difficult word. The children responded like they knew they were seen, like they mattered. Keanu felt something stir in his chest. A strange ache, like admiration and guilt woven together. How many times had she passed him silently in the hallway, setting down a cup of tea or folding a towel? And here she was, building something that changed lives every single Thursday afternoon. As the story reached its end, the kids burst into applause, then hurried back to their stations. Rosa wiped her hands, stood, and walked to a dusty whiteboard by the door. She began listing tasks in Spanish. Plantas, barrer, limpar pinceles, plants, sweep, clean brushes. The children jumped into action like it was a game. Keanu stepped back into the shadows. He couldn't walk through that gate, not yet. This wasn't about him, this was her world. He returned to his car slowly, the rain soaking through his collar, though he hardly noticed. The sound of children's laughter still echoed in his ears. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, unmoving. He had followed her out of curiosity, maybe concern. What he'd found was something more humbling. Rosa Mendoza wasn't just his housekeeper. She was the heartbeat of something beautiful. And somehow, he knew this was just the beginning. Rain slicked the city in silver that afternoon. Keanu Reeves sat astride a modest black motorcycle, his figure mostly concealed by a dark hooded jacket and tinted visor. He wasn't chasing a role or dodging the paparazzi this time. Instead, his eyes were locked on the receding figure of Rosa Mendoza, his longtime housekeeper, who had just boarded the number 34 bus headed east. She didn't see him. He never turned around. He hadn't planned this. The idea had crept in only hours earlier, quietly, like a whisper he couldn't shake. Every Thursday, Rosa left his home at exactly 3:30. She was always efficient, always respectful. But Thursdays were different. She worked just as hard, but with a kind of restrained urgency. And it wasn't until today, when he saw the fatigue in her face as she folded the guest towels, followed by a sudden distant smile when she glanced at the clock, that the question finally stuck. Where did she go? Now, here he was, navigating behind her at a cautious distance, weaving between the light rain and traffic. He wasn't stalking her, that wasn't his nature, but something about the way she hurried toward the bus had unsettled him. It wasn't fear, it was purpose. The bus took a route unfamiliar to him, winding through aging parts of East LA, past small churches, pawn shops, and taco trucks, lining cracked sidewalks. Keanu followed from behind, careful not to draw attention. At one point, a pair of teenagers gave his motorcycle a second glance, but quickly lost interest when he lowered his head and idled behind a parked van. After 20 minutes, Rosa transferred to another bus, the 126, a line even fewer people used these days. This time, Keanu left the bike behind and followed on foot from a distance, tucking his hands deep into his pockets and keeping to the shadows cast by aging street lamps. He could see her shoulders rising and falling under the weight of her thin wool coat, still damp from the earlier drizzle. The rain began again, harder now. Keanu moved slower, letting the drops blur the world around him. He'd played spies in movies, but this was no performance. This was real. And with every step deeper into the neighborhood, the contrast with his own life grew starker. Buildings leaned against each other like tired bodies. Wires dangled from power poles. And yet Rosa's pace never faltered. She stepped off the bus on a quiet corner lined with shuttered storefronts and broken awnings. Keanu stopped beneath a tree dripping with rain, watching from across the street as she made her way past a laundromat and into a side alley flanked by graffiti-covered walls. He waited 10 seconds, then 20, and then, with the quietest breath, he crossed the street and followed her in. Keanu stepped lightly into the alley, boots skimming puddles as the dim gray sky narrowed above him. The buildings on either side leaned close, like old men exchanging secrets, their facades mottled with age, rust, and half-faded murals. He could still hear Rosa's footsteps ahead, soft, steady, and somehow unafraid. A cat darted across the alley, startling him. He paused, listening. There she was. Rosa had stopped at the far end where the alley opened into a fenced lot. She adjusted her coat, pulled something from her bag, a small, colorful umbrella, and opened it with care. Then, without hesitation, she ducked between two sagging dumpsters and disappeared behind a cracked wooden gate tucked nearly invisible in the brick wall. Keanu frowned. There were no signs, no labels, just the sound of voices, faint, high-pitched, almost musical, coming from beyond the fence. Children. He crept closer, crouched low near the gate's edge. Through the gaps in the wood, he saw a narrow courtyard tucked behind the buildings, and in the center of that courtyard, something extraordinary. A hand-painted mural stretched across one wall, bright and defiant against the gray surroundings. It depicted a garden, tomato vines, sunflowers, tall corn stalks, all painted as if growing from a cracked sidewalk. In the mural's center stood a woman holding a watering can. Her face was kind, her eyes weary, and the resemblance to Rosa was unmistakable. Keanu's breath caught. He shifted slightly, careful not to make a sound. Children were gathered beneath a sagging tarp fashioned into a rain shelter. Folding tables lined with paper cups and crayons stood beneath it. Rosa stood with them now, smiling in a way he'd never seen before. Not the polite smile she gave when he complimented her cooking. This one was wider, brighter, rooted in something deeper. A boy in a wheelchair rolled up beside her. Rosa bent low, pressing her forehead gently to his. Whatever he said made her laugh, and then she raised her arms like a conductor and clapped once. The courtyard transformed. Children leapt into motion, some gathering gardening gloves from a bin, others rushing to a collection of plastic containers filled with soil and tiny green sprouts. Keanu leaned closer. They were planting. In this corner of the city, behind dumpsters and broken brick, they were building a garden in the rain. It didn't make sense. Not to him. Not yet. Why was Rosa, who spoke so little and carried herself with such restraint, here in this hidden world? Who were these kids? And how long had she been doing this? While quietly folding laundry in his home and sweeping his floors without ever mentioning a word? A gust of wind blew water from the tarp and one of the children squealed. Rosa rushed over, checking each of them, her hands quick, her voice calm. Keanu watched her, suddenly aware that he'd never really seen her before. The rain deepened, hammering the tin rooftops and pooling in the uneven pavement, but the small garden came alive with energy. Keanu stayed hidden, not out of shame, but reverence. It felt sacred somehow, this crumbling place transformed by care, made beautiful not by wealth, but by hands that refused to give up. He watched Rosa move between the children, her soaked coat clinging to her back. One boy was trying to tie a string around a wooden stake to support a bean plant. His fingers trembled with effort, and the knot slipped twice. Rosa knelt beside him, her hands guiding his. She didn't rush him. She let him struggle until he succeeded, then clapped once, whispering something that made him grin. Another girl waved a drawing in the air, a crayon sketch of vegetables dancing in the rain. Rosa took it, examined it like it was fine art, then pinned it to a board beneath the mural with a clothespin. The board already held dozens like it, all soggy but vivid. Carrots with faces, sunflowers taller than buildings, a row of tomatoes spelling out hope. Keanu's throat tightened. How many hours had gone into this place? How many unnoticed acts of love? Suddenly, a splash echoed behind him. He turned. A teenager with a hoodie and earbuds had entered the alley from the other end and now stood eyeing him suspiciously. The kid said nothing, just looked at Keanu's rain-drenched figure, then at the crack in the gate where he'd been watching. Recognition flickered across his face. Just a flicker, but he didn't say anything. Keanu raised a finger to his lips. The teen paused, then gave a single nod and kept walking, vanishing into the rain. He turned back to the gate, heart pounding harder now. He had no idea what he would say if someone caught him. He wasn't spying. He wasn't judging. He just didn't know how to walk away. One of the children near Rosa pointed suddenly, eyes wide. Rosa followed the gesture and froze. For a moment, Keanu thought she was looking straight at him. But it was the alley beyond, the one he'd come through, that drew her attention. She stood, alert, as if sensing something wrong. Then, slowly, she moved toward the gate. Keanu backed away, careful not to make noise. He ducked into a nearby alcove as the gate creaked open. Rosa stepped out into the alley, eyes scanning. Her umbrella was gone now. Rain streaked her cheeks like tears. She didn't see him. She just stood there, alone, breathing heavily. Then she whispered something, almost to herself. Not again. She closed the gate behind her with care, pressing her palm to the wood as if to seal something inside. Keanu waited until she disappeared from view before slipping out of the alley entirely, blending into the street with his hood still up. The rain hadn't let up, but something else inside him had cracked open. He hadn't just discovered a secret. He'd stumbled into something sacred. and he wasn't ready to walk away. Keanu stepped back behind the edge of a rusted storage shed, his heart still from the shock of what he'd stumbled upon. The alleyway had given way to a clearing he hadn't expected, a hidden space, nestled between buildings that didn't belong in the weary silence of the neighborhood. It was as if the city had cracked open just enough to let light grow from its seams. And in that seam, Rosa stood at the center. It was a garden, but not like anything manicured or staged for a magazine spread. Raised wooden beds lined the space in rough symmetry, their surfaces exploding with tomatoes, peppers, kale, squash blossoms, and flowers he couldn't name. Bamboo trellises leaned slightly with the weight of runner beans. Small, mismatched signs labeled each bed in a child's handwriting. Marigolds, carrots, Zara's tomatoes. A series of homemade compost bins stood on one side, half covered with a blue tarp, and a few wheelbarrows rested near a tool shed built from salvaged wood. But the plants weren't what stunned Keanu. It was Rosa. She was radiant here. Not dressed in her usual pressed uniform, not quiet or careful with her words. She wore a simple green t-shirt and worn jeans, hair tied back in a loose braid. Her laughter echoed through the garden, rich and unrestrained. Children rushed toward her, arms outstretched, calling her name. She dropped to her knees, gathering them into her arms as they crowded around her, each eager to share something. An earthworm, a new leaf, a crooked carrot. Keanu leaned into the wall of the shed for balance, watching her transformation. She wasn't tired. She wasn't distant. She was alive in a way he hadn't known a person could be. He felt like an intruder, as if he'd cracked open a private moment he had no right to witness. A teenage girl passed by, pushing a cart full of watering cans, then handed them to smaller children, who lined up at a row of spigots made from old soda bottles and tubing. An elderly woman emerged from a doorway behind the garden with a tray of lemonade in mismatched plastic cups. The kids ran toward her, shouting greetings in both English and Spanish. Rosa thanked the woman with a kiss to the cheek and handed out the drinks, making sure the littlest ones had 2 hands on their cups before sending them off to sit on overturned buckets and milk crates. Teenagers arrived next, pulling gloves from backpacks and snapping on baseball caps. One of them rang a small bell, calling out "Tool check-in" in a mock-serious tone that made the younger kids giggle. A girl no older than 14 stood beside Rosa, holding up a clipboard and calling out names. The children responded with practiced routine, collecting trowels, rakes, watering cans, some from a shed, others from a green canvas bin labeled "Kid Tools." Keanu's breath caught as he realized this wasn't just a garden, it was a sanctuary. And Rosa, somehow, was at the heart of it. Keanu remained hidden behind the shed, uncertain whether to stay or leave, but his feet wouldn't move, not yet. The longer he watched, the more layers unfolded. The space wasn't just organized, it had rhythm, purpose. The older kids led the younger ones in weeding and compost turning like it was second nature. A boy with a pronounced limp carefully checked cucumber vines with a magnifying glass. Another teen wrote notes in a spiral-bound notebook, tracking moisture levels in the soil. Then came the lessons. Under a makeshift awning strung with colored flags, a folding whiteboard appeared. Rosa stood at its center, marker in hand. The children gathered in a semicircle, eager eyes on her. Her voice floated through the air, confident and warm. Who remembers what nitrogen does for plants? A few hands shot up. One small girl answered, "It helps the leaves grow." "Exactly," Rosa nodded. "And what about potassium?" "Flowers and fruit," came the chorus reply. She smiled, then turned back to the board and began sketching a diagram of a tomato plant. Keanu couldn't believe what he was seeing. At his house, Rosa moved so quietly it was easy to forget she was even there. But here, she wasn't invisible. She was essential. A rustle of laughter drew his attention to a group of toddlers in the corner. They weren't planting or weeding. They were painting. bright streaks of yellow and green on wooden slats that would likely become plant markers or signs. A teen knelt beside them, encouraging each stroke like it was a masterpiece. Keanu blinked. Art and agriculture. It was all connected. An older man, probably in his 70s, wheeled out a cart of seedlings from the shaded side of the garden. He moved with careful hands, gently distributing the trays to different teams. Rosa met him halfway with a respectful nod, exchanging a few quiet words that made the man chuckle. Keanu noticed how everyone, children, teens, elders, treated each other as equals. Titles didn't matter here. Kindness did. Then Rosa's laughter rang out again, this time deeper, richer, as a toddler handed her a wriggling worm with pride. She held it up like a prize, and the children squealed with delight. It was the freest Keanu had ever seen her, not in a movie, not on a press tour, but here, in a muddy garden no one outside this block probably even knew existed. He felt a pang of guilt. He had always respected Rosa's boundaries, her need for space and quiet. But maybe that had been the problem. Maybe he'd assumed she wanted to be unseen, when in truth, she had simply been waiting for someone to notice who she really was. Behind the shed, Keanu's throat tightened. He had followed her, expecting, what? A side job? A secret? But not this. Not joy. Not leadership. Not a whole community built around someone who spent her days sweeping his kitchen floors in silence. He looked down at his hands and whispered, "Who are you, Rosa Mendoza?" Keanu remained still, sheltered by the shed's shadow, as rain began to softly tap the tin roof above him. The light drizzle didn't deter anyone. In fact, it seemed to invigorate the children. A teenage girl called out in Spanish, rallying the kids to bring buckets under the downspouts. Within moments, a system was in place. 5-gallon buckets lined up to catch rainwater, every drop a resource. The elderly man returned to the center with a small, portable speaker. Music began to play. Gentle Latin guitar, something old, familiar, and rich with soul. Children danced barefoot in the damp earth, spinning with arms wide. Keanu watched as Rosa swayed with them, laughing again, her hair damp, her face turned upward to meet the sky. She looked whole. Keanu's chest ached. He'd seen Rosa for years, passed her in his hallway, thanked her for folded towels and swept floors. But he had never known this version of her. The woman who led a movement, however small. The woman who turned a forgotten lot into a sanctuary. The woman whose hands cultivated both soil and confidence. Just then, a boy around 10 noticed Keanu. His eyes locked onto the stranger in the shadows. Keanu instinctively stepped back, but it was too late. The boy pointed. "Señor Rosa." Rosa turned. Her eyes narrowed. She saw him. Keanu stepped forward slowly, palms slightly raised. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't even sure he had the right to speak. She walked toward him alone, her boots caked in mud, her shoulders straight. "You followed me," she said quietly, eyes unreadable. "I did," Keanu admitted. "I wasn't trying to invade anything. He paused. "I've seen you every day, but not like this. I didn't know you?" Rosa studied him, her breath steady despite the soft tremor in her fingers. "This place isn't a secret, Keanu. It's just not something I ever thought would matter to someone like you." He blanked. "Someone like me? Famous, powerful, comfortable." Her words didn't sting, they sobered him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought I was just being curious. But now I realize I've been blind." Behind her, the children had grown quiet, watching the exchange. Some stood with curious eyes. Others clutched small trowels or seed packets, unsure whether this visitor was friend or threat. Keanu looked past Rosa to them, then back at her. This place? It's beautiful. Rosa exhaled. Not relief, not anger, something in between. She nodded toward the children. They think it belongs to them. And maybe it does. He swallowed hard. Would it be okay if I stayed a while? Just to see what you've built? Rosa didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she stepped aside and gestured toward the garden with a small nod. They're planting sunflowers today, she said. They say they help chase away bad spirits. Keanu stepped forward into the clearing light rain, toward the children, toward the raised beds and handmade signs, toward the world Rosa had built when no one was watching. A soft breeze stirred the leaves as Keanu crouched behind a splintered shed, barely daring to breathe. The garden unfolded before him like a dream. Every corner brimmed with color and movement. Raised beds overflowed with vegetables, green beans climbing trellises, eggplants nestled among mint, and rows of neatly staked tomato plants. A small chalkboard sign read, "Thursday lesson, companion planting." Children darted between the beds, laughing, their shoes muddy, their hands full of clippings, gloves, and joy. Then he saw her. A little girl with unruly curls and a pair of oversized rubber boots stomped through a puddle and marched toward Rosa, holding something behind her back. Rosa looked up from helping an elderly man adjust an irrigation hose. The moment she saw the girl, her face softened into a wide, radiant smile. "Señorita Rosa," the girl squealed, drawing the attention of a few nearby kids. "You have to see it." Rosa wiped her hands on her apron and bent slightly to meet the girl's level. "Is it your moon tomatoes, Annabelle?" Annabelle grinned, then brought forward a small cluster of green tomatoes in her palms. "Not the ones I picked, the ones still growing. I made a name sign. Come." Rosa followed her past rows of marigolds and kale until they reached a modest, raised bed at the far corner. Annabelle pointed proudly. A wooden stake held a handmade sign, "Future Moon Tomatoes. Do not pick unless you are NASA." Rosa burst into warm, genuine laughter. Keanu felt his chest tighten. He'd never heard Rosa laugh like that. Not the polite chuckle she gave when dusting a shelf, or the tired smile when handing him a freshly pressed shirt. This was joy, unfiltered. She wasn't just teaching here. She was home. "You think you can grow tomatoes on the moon?" Rosa asked. Annabelle planted her hands on her hips. "Yup, I'll be the first garden astronaut. They said plants need sunlight and water. I'll figure it out." Rosa knelt beside her. "And what about gravity?" Annabelle blinked. "I'll plant them upside down." Rosa laughed again and reached for the soil. She gently pressed her fingers into it. "Look, it's damp. See that? That means the roots are getting what they need. And look, no wilting. You've been doing your job." Annabelle beamed. "I told Marco to help me water. He remembers." At the mention of the name, Keanu's eyes shifted. Rosa turned to a boy in a wheelchair positioned beside a planter box. He held a small moisture meter and was carefully pushing it into the soil. Rosa approached and squatted down beside him. "What's it say, Marco?" "Perfect moisture, but we might need to check the compost mix," he replied seriously. "You're getting good," Rosa said, brushing his shoulder gently. "I want to be a scientist," Marco replied. "Like the ones who work with plants in Antarctica?" Keanu blinked. This wasn't just gardening, it was science. Purpose. Dreams. Then a voice rang out like a bell across the yard. "Wait, that's Keanureev." Every child in the garden stopped what they were doing. Trowels hit the dirt. Watering cans paused mid-air. Even the teens near the tool shed froze as they turned toward the source of the voice. Annabelle's eyes were wide as saucers. She pointed directly at Keanu, still half hidden behind the shed, his hood pulled up, his hands half raised in sheepish surrender. It's really him, she squealed. Rosa turned around so quickly she nearly lost her balance. Her face drained of color, then flushed a deep pink. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She stood up straight, wiping her hands on her apron again, as if trying to compose herself. Keanu stepped out slowly, hands at his sides, his posture humble. He gave a small wave. "Hey," he said simply, his voice calm and low. "Sorry to crash the garden party." The silence broke like glass. One of the kids gasped. Another whispered, "No way, that's the guy from the dog movie." "I think he's also the Matrix," someone else added. Marco grinned. "He's the guy who saved a bus from exploding." Keanu smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "I've done a few things," he said lightly. Rosa approached him slowly, her brows knit with confusion and tension. "Mr. Reeves, what are you doing here?" He hesitated. "Honestly, I followed you. I have noticed you always leave early on Thursdays, and today I got curious. I was worried. The rain, the urgency, you seemed like you were rushing somewhere important. I didn't mean to intrude." The look on Rosa's face flickered between disbelief and something softer, an emotion she quickly buried beneath professionalism. She glanced around at the children now gathering around them. "Everyone," she said, trying to sound composed, "this is Mr. Reeves. I clean his house." Annabelle squinted. "Wait, you're his maid?" Rosa nodded slowly. "Yes." Annabelle's eyes darted back and forth between them. "But you work here." "I do," Rosa said gently. "Both are work, just different kinds." Keanu cleared his throat. "I didn't come to spy. I just didn't know this part of your life existed, and I'm glad I found it." He looked around at the children, the garden beds, the handmade signs, the tools patched with duct tape, the joy woven into every inch of soil. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to find. Maybe a second job, maybe a struggle, but not this, not a sanctuary. Mrs. Ortiz, the elderly woman who had served lemonade earlier, walked up beside Rosa. Her face was wrinkled with both suspicion and wisdom. "You know this man?" she asked in Spanish. "Sí, señora," Rosa replied. "He's my employer." Mrs. Ortiz peered up at Keanu. "You're wet. You want lemonade?" Keanu smiled. "If it's not too much trouble." Mrs. Ortiz nodded, then turned to Annabelle. "2 cups, quickly." Annabelle sprinted toward the folding table with a grin. Rosa looked at Keanu again, her expression unreadable. "You really followed me through the rain?" He nodded. "And I think I'm glad I did." Annabelle returned triumphantly, holding out 2 paper cups of lemonade like golden trophies. Keanu accepted his with a soft, "Thank you," then crouched beside her. "So, I hear you're growing tomatoes for the moon," he said with a quiet grin. Annabelle beamed. "Not just the moon, Mars too. But first, I gotta get them really strong, like superhero tomatoes." Keanu took a sip of the lemonade and chuckled. "What makes a superhero tomato?" She raised a finger with mock seriousness. "Thick skin, deep roots, and lots of love." Behind them, Marco nodded solemnly. "And sunlight. Even in space, plants need light. That's what I'm figuring out." Keanu looked between the 2 children. "You both seem like experts." Rosa stood nearby, still quiet, watching the interaction unfold with an odd blend of pride and protectiveness. These were her kids. Maybe not by blood, but certainly by heart. This garden, hidden from the world, was where she poured her soul every Thursday afternoon. One of the teenagers called out from the compost area. "Miss Rosa, we need more dry leaves for the pile." "I'll be right there," she replied, then glanced at Keanu. "Excuse me." He nodded, giving her space, and turned back to the children. "What you call this place?" he asked. Annabelle shrugged. "We just call it the garden. Sometimes Rosa calls it El Refugio. That's Spanish. It means like a safe place." Keanu glanced around. He could feel it now. This wasn't just a patch of vegetables between buildings. This was protection, connection. A tiny ecosystem of care and creativity in a part of the city where such things were too often paved over. "I like that," he said. "El Refugio." Marco rolled his wheelchair forward. "We started with just 3 beds, now we have 15. Rosa taught us how to compost and how to keep bugs off the plants without chemicals. She knows everything. She also fixes things," Annabelle added. "Last week the rain barrel was leaking and she patched it with a rubber glove and 2 screws. Keanu raised his eyebrows. "Impressive." A sudden gust of wind sent a cascade of leaves swirling across the garden. Annabelle chased them, giggling, while Marco calmly adjusted his notebook on his lap and continued drawing diagrams. Keanu looked over. "Are you designing something?" Marco turned the page toward him. "It's an idea for vertical planting beds for smaller spaces." Keanu studied the sketch. It was rough, but thoughtful. "You came up with this yourself?" Marco shrugged. "I read a lot, and I watch videos when I get Wi-Fi. Plants need space, but some families don't even have yards. So, I'm trying to build up, not out." Keanu felt something stir in his chest, a kind of quiet awe. These kids weren't just learning to garden, they were inventing, dreaming, solving problems their communities faced with cardboard, tape, and imagination. He looked at Marco, then over at Rosa, who was now laughing with Mrs. Ortiz near the compost pile. And in that moment, he knew. This place mattered. Rosa froze when she saw him. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face as Keanu stepped out from behind the shed, his soaked hoodie clinging to him like a second skin. For a moment, no one spoke. The children's chatter had stopped. Annabelle stood motionless, still pointing. Keanu lifted his hands slightly, palms open as if surrendering. "I didn't mean to," he started, his voice low, apologetic. "I wasn't spying, I saw you leave every Thursday and..." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I was curious." "And worried?" Rosa blinked, disbelief flickering in her expression. "You followed me?" Keanu nodded. "I know how that sounds. I swear, it wasn't anything weird. You've always been so kind and professional. But I noticed how you always left at the same time every Thursday, rain or shine. I had a feeling something mattered." A man with a broad frame and a thick mustache stepped forward from the group of adults. His voice was wary. "Is he bothering you, Rosa?" She shook her head slowly, though her voice was still caught in her throat. "No. He's my boss." That caused a ripple through the group. Several adults exchanged looks. One of the teenagers whispered, "That's really him, isn't it?" "Yes," Rosa said, louder now, trying to collect herself. "Everyone, this is Keanu Reeves. He's the man I work for. At his house." Keanu gave a small wave, awkward and drenched. "Hi. Again, I'm really sorry for dropping in like this." An older woman, wrapped in a shawl despite the heat, squinted at him and muttered, "He looks too skinny to be a movie star." Someone chuckled. Tension cracked just slightly. The children were still silent, unsure of what to make of it all. Rosa walked over to them slowly, brushing wet hair from her face, then looked back at Keanu. "Why didn't you just ask?" "I didn't know how," he said honestly. "This place clearly means something to you, and now I see why." A long pause settled between them. Behind Rosa, the wheelchair-bound boy slowly wheeled forward. "Miss Rosa? Is he staying?" Rosa looked over her shoulder at the boy, then back at Keanu. Her shoulders dropped slightly. "I don't know, Mateo. I guess that depends." Then the older woman in the shawl stepped forward. "Well, he's already wet. Might as well feed him." Another chuckle, this time a bit warmer. Rosa turned to her with a soft smile. "Abuela, please." but Abuela had already disappeared behind a sliding door. A moment later, the smell of warm tamales drifted out with the steam. Keanu stood there, still unsure whether he should stay or leave. His clothes dripped steadily onto the cracked cement. The garden had returned to its rhythm, cautiously. A few kids resumed checking plant beds under Rosa's soft instructions, but the curiosity in their glances hadn't faded. He could feel it. Then Rosa walked up to him and handed him a dry towel someone had fetched. "Here," she said gently, not quite looking him in the eyes. "You'll catch cold standing there like a lost dog." Keanu chuckled under his breath, grateful for the kindness. "Thanks," he murmured, rubbing his face dry. She stood beside him, arms crossed. "You really just followed me? No driver, no cameras, no one knew?" "I rode my motorcycle," Keanu replied. "I left it 3 blocks back. I didn't want to make a scene. I just wanted to understand." Rosa studied him. "And now that you do?" "I'm not sure I understand yet," he admitted. "But I can see this is important. The way the kids ran to you, the way you smiled, it's different. It's beautiful." That caught her off guard. For a split second, the corner of her mouth twitched with restrained warmth, but she shook it off. "This place isn't for Hollywood." "I know. That's why I didn't want to disturb it," he said. "But I also didn't want to pretend like I never saw it." One of the teenage girls walked by with a basket of soil tools and looked at Rosa. "Is he going to help or just stand there being famous?" Keanu smiled. "I can help, if I don't mess anything up." The girl narrowed her eyes. "Can you carry heavy bags?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Try me." She tossed him a pair of gloves. "All right, Mr. Movie Star, come help us with the compost." Rosa smirked as Keanu slipped the gloves on. "Don't say I didn't warn you." By the time the tamales were ready, Keanu had carried 6 burlap sacks of compost to the far end of the garden and was brushing sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. It was the most physically real thing he'd done all week. No handlers, no contracts. Just work. And strangely, it felt good. Abuela called out from the open doorway, her voice clear. "Ven a cama, niños, and bring the tall one too." Keanu followed the line of kids and volunteers toward the folding tables set up under the awning. Metal chairs scraped pavement as everyone gathered around, forming a wide, uneven circle of mismatched plates and plastic cups. Rosa handed him a paper plate with 2 steaming tamales wrapped in banana leaves. "Sit," she said simply. Keanu lowered himself onto a squeaky folding chair beside Mateo, the boy in the wheelchair, who gave him a shy smile. "Don't spill the salsa," Mateo warned, holding his own plate carefully. "Ms. Rosa said." Keanu nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll be on my best behavior." They ate in relative quiet at first, the kind that settles when strangers share a space that's slowly becoming familiar. Keanu chewed thoughtfully, surprised by the warmth of the tamales, the homemade flavor that reminded him of kitchens he hadn't visited in years. It wasn't gourmet, but it tasted like something far rarer. Care. "Do you always eat like this after the garden work?" he asked Mateo. The boy nodded. "Mostly, if someone brings food. If not, we share whatever we can." Rosa, sitting across from them, heard and added, "Some nights it's just lemonade and bread, but we never let the kids go home hungry if we can help it." Keanu glanced around. The faces, brown, lined, soft, hopeful, watched him not as a celebrity, but as a guest. A newcomer still earning his place. The weight of that made him sit straighter. Annabelle, still clutching her empty tamale wrapper, leaned toward Rosa. "Can Mr. Reeves come next Thursday too? He was good at compost." A ripple of laughter spread through the group. Even David, a broad-shouldered man who had been silently wary the entire time, cracked a reluctant grin. "We'll see," Rosa said, glancing at Keanu. "I'd like to," he replied softly. "If I'm welcome." Mrs. Vasquez nodded slowly. placing a firm hand on his shoulder as she passed behind him with a tray of lemonade cups. "We don't care about movie stars here, mijo. We care about hands and hearts. You showed both today." It was the simplest kind of approval, and yet it sank deep. Keanu felt it settle somewhere beneath the years of fame and distance. After the meal, the kids scattered to clean up. Some stacked chairs, others scraped plates into a compost bin. Keanu stood and helped fold tables, his movements mirroring theirs. At one point, Annabelle brought him a small broom. "For the path," she said, pointing to the garden walkway, still speckled with soil. Keanu took it and swept in silence, the motion calming. He caught Rosa watching him again, her expression unreadable. "I hope I didn't embarrass you," he said when they found themselves alone near the greenhouse. "You surprised me," Rosa admitted. "But no, you didn't embarrass me." He looked down. "I meant it when I said I wasn't trying to intrude. I believe you." A pause. Then Rosa folded her arms. "You asked earlier if this place was important. It's more than that. It's our roots in the concrete. These kids, they grow here. And sometimes, so do we." Keanu nodded. "I saw that. I think I needed to." She tilted her head. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because sometimes I forget where real things happen. I live in a world of cameras and scripts. It reminded me what's real." The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows through the alley. Rosa turned to go, but said, "If you come back, you work. No more hiding behind sheds." Keanu smiled. "Deal." The rain softened into a steady whisper as Keanu stood near the shed, steam rising from the tamales in his hands. The warmth of the food couldn't quite match the quiet warmth of the space itself. Around him, children were laughing under the tarp canopy, and a few elders huddled together over mugs of something hot and herbal. Rosa leaned against a wooden post, her arms crossed. Not cold, just guarded. Keanu walked over, taking his time. "These are really good," he said, holding up the half-eaten tamale. "Who made them?" Rosa didn't smile, but her tone was softer than before. "Mrs. Alvarez. She's been making them since before I got here. Says the secret is corn husks from home, not the ones you get in bags." "She's gifted," Keanu said, then paused. "I mean that." A beat of silence passed. Rosa nodded toward the rows of raised beds behind them. "You want to know what this place is? Why I come here every week?" He didn't respond right away, just looked her in the eyes and nodded once. Rosa folded her arms tighter. "It started 5 years ago. The last grocery store in this area shut down, not enough profit. People had to take 2 buses just to buy fresh vegetables. Some just stopped trying. Kids started coming to school tired, angry. The corner stores sell sugar, chips, nothing with life in it." She motioned to the soil. This ground was just a trash lot between 2 buildings. Syringes, broken glass, mattress springs. But Mrs. Vasquez, her son owns the buildings, gave us permission to clean it. We had no money, just hands and grief. That's what we built with. Keanu looked at the small greenhouse in the corner, the mismatched shelves of reused wood, the plastic signs shaped by small hands. It didn't look like grief anymore. It looked like life. "You did all this with volunteers?" She nodded. "Mostly mothers and grandmothers. Then the kids started showing up. Curious at first, then staying. We made up roles. Tool captain, compost king, tomato queen. It gave them purpose. Some of the kids who used to ditch school now lead garden tours for their teachers." Keanu took a slow breath, letting the sound of the garden fill the spaces between their words. The drizzle hadn't stopped, but the people hadn't left either. Rosa stared out at the children, carefully placing mulch under the older trees. "It's more than food. We grow things here that aren't in any textbook. Dignity, trust. A little girl told me once that the garden smells like her dreams. That's what we protect every Thursday. Keanu felt the knot tighten in his chest. She turned to him then, her eyes tired but sharp. You ever wonder why someone like me, quiet, polite, always on time, knows the pH balance of 3 kinds of soil and how to graft tomatoes by hand? He said nothing. Rosa glanced at the greenhouse. I used to be Dr. Rosa Mendoza, Agricultural Science, National University of Mexico. Keanu stood still, the words hanging in the air heavier than the rain clouds overhead. Dr. Rosa Mendoza. The title echoed in his mind like a distant bell suddenly struck. He had assumed she was private, maybe shy, but this wasn't shyness. This was something else entirely. A history hidden behind aprons and cleaning rags. She seemed to sense his thoughts. I left Mexico 10 years ago, she said quietly. Not because I wanted to. I had published 3 peer-reviewed studies on urban agriculture under climate stress. I spoke at conferences. But then came the cuts. The labs lost funding and I lost my position. They said my work didn't serve commercial interests. Keanu's voice was barely a whisper. So, you came here. She nodded. I thought it would be temporary. I had an uncle here in California. He said maybe I could teach. Maybe I could find something in research again. She gave a bitter laugh. But my degrees weren't accepted. No license, no connections. I didn't speak English well enough. Doors closed. So I cleaned. She looked away, her jaw set against something far deeper than pride. People think cleaning houses is simple. But there's nothing simple about walking past framed diplomas and lab books while scrubbing someone's sink. It humbles you. Or it breaks you. Sometimes both. Keanu exhaled slowly. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? She asked, her tone sharp but not angry. That I used to teach college students, but now I clean bathtubs for a living? Most people don't want that conversation. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them feel guilty. He didn't deny it. Because he couldn't. The two of them stood beneath the dripping edge of the tarp. Behind them, the sound of children's laughter and the rustle of tools moving over wet earth filled the silence. I didn't mean to follow you like that, Keanu said eventually. It wasn't about checking up on you. I sensed there was something more, something important. Her eyes softened. You were right. This place, it's the only thing that's kept me sane. I might clean houses for money, but here, I use everything I know. I teach composting ratios and crop rotation. I build irrigation out of recycled gutters. I run pest control workshops for kids using neem oil and garlic spray. And every Thursday, for just a few hours, I remember who I used to be. Keanu looked at her, really looked, past the apron, past the polite nods, past the carefully guarded silences. He saw someone who had once shaped the world with knowledge, now shaping it again with dirt-covered hands and borrowed tools. And the others? He asked, motioning toward the community. Rosa nodded slowly. You'd be surprised. There's a former architect out there teaching kids how to build trellises. A retired teacher giving literacy lessons under the lemon tree. A woman who used to be a nurse now mixing natural remedies from herbs we grow. We've all been pushed aside, but this place gives us a way to matter again. The sound of the rain softened into a rhythm, falling gently on the patchwork shelter above. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, absorbing everything Rosa had just shared. It wasn't just a garden. It was a reclamation of identity, of purpose, of dignity. How many people know? He asked quietly. About my past? Rosa shrugged. Not many. The kids know me as the garden lady. The elders call me profesora sometimes, but I've never told them the whole story, not because I'm ashamed, just because they're fighting their own battles. We don't dwell on what we lost. We focus on what we build. Keanu looked out toward the muddy rows of plants, where children in raincoats were checking on seedlings, even in the drizzle. And you built all this? I helped start it, she said, but it belongs to everyone now. The land was just a trash-strewn lot when we found it. Mrs. Alvarez, the woman who owns the building behind it, gave us permission to use it. We cleaned it up, brought in soil, built beds out of old pallets. First it was just tomatoes and cilantro, then beans, then carrots. Every season we added more. She pointed to a line of rain barrels painted with murals. The kids painted those. We collect water from the roofs. We compost kitchen scraps from nearby apartments. Every square foot of this place has been touched by someone's hands. We grow more than food here. We grow trust. Keanu felt his throat tighten. You've done something most people wouldn't believe is possible. That's because they don't look closely, Rosa replied. They see poverty and assume there's nothing else. But if you scratch the surface, you'll find artists, engineers, musicians, healers, hidden in plain sight. He nodded, the weight of her words pressing gently but firmly into his chest. A small voice broke the quiet. Ms. Rosa, we finished checking the lettuce. Some of them got slug bites again. They both turned. Annabelle stood there with a clipboard nearly as big as her chest, her tomato-covered boots splattered with mud. Thanks, mija, Rosa said. Put the notes by the shed. We'll make garlic spray this weekend. Annabelle nodded solemnly and ran off toward a group of kids gathered around a compost bin. Keanu smiled faintly. She's determined. She's brilliant, Rosa said proudly. She's 8 years old and already knows more about soil pH than I did at 20. The admiration in her voice was unmistakable. After a pause, she turned back to Keanu. You came here by accident, but you stayed. That says something. Keanu looked out again at the garden, the colors, the laughter, the muddy hands tending fragile shoots, and realized he hadn't just stumbled onto something beautiful, he'd stepped into something urgent, something sacred. I think, he said slowly, I'd like to come back next Thursday, if that's okay. Rosa studied him, her eyes thoughtful. Then she smiled. Bring gloves. Keanu sat beneath the canvas tarp, his borrowed jacket still damp but forgotten. The soft drumming of the rain overhead blurred into the background as Rosa guided him gently across the garden toward a nearby bench. A group of teenagers had gathered under a separate awning made from scrap plastic and old tent poles. They were huddled around a battered laptop, laughing quietly, trading ideas and keystrokes like musicians riffing off a shared melody. One of them, a thin boy with braces on his legs and a sparkle in his eyes, looked up when Rosa approached. Tay, she said, smiling warmly. This is Keanu. The boy's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't react like a fan. Instead, he motioned Keanu over with the same ease he might offer to a friend. I was just showing them how to optimize our sensor code, Ty explained. We're trying to track moisture levels in the raised beds and automate alerts when they're too dry. It's not perfect yet, but the data is promising. Keanu blinked. You built that? Tay nodded. Well, the sensors were donated by a local college. They were junk, old, busted, mismatched, but I rewired them. I'm self-taught. Started with broken calculators when I was 8. Keanu leaned in. How do you even run this system? Solar panels from old garden lights, one battery bank. Rosa helped us design the layout. Keanu looked at Rosa, who shrugged, almost shy. Ty's done all the thinking. I just helped him mount the panels. Keanu studied the boy, a teen with no formal schooling and coding, hacking together a functional irrigation system from scraps. He felt an uncomfortable shift inside, something akin to shame and awe. You said you're self-taught. My mom used to clean apartments downtown. She brought home a broken laptop someone threw out. I fixed it. I watched tutorials at the library. Slow Wi-Fi, but I didn't care. It was like decoding a language. Keanu sat beside him, heart pounding with something he couldn't name. These weren't just underprivileged kids tinkering in a garden. They were creators, engineers, innovators. And they were invisible to most of the world. Rosa tapped his shoulder. "That's not all. Come meet the others." She led him past a patch of squash and marigolds toward a small wooden shed. Inside, a man in his 50s stood over a table filled with clear jars. A soft chemical scent filled the air. Fermentation, compost tea, herbal tinctures. "This is Javier," Rosa said. "He used to be a chemist in Colombia." Javier turned slowly. His accent was thick, but his eyes were sharp. "Bienvenido," he said, nodding. "Sorry for the mess. I'm refining pest repellents. No pesticides, only organics. My daughter had asthma." "You're a chemist?" Keanu asked softly. Javier smiled. "I clean offices now, but I remember enough." Keanu looked around the shed. Neatly labeled compounds, careful notes pinned above the desk, a precision to everything. It was like walking into a lab, one built from faith and discarded tools. Keanu watched as Javier poured a translucent green liquid from one jar into another through a strainer made from an old t-shirt. "This one uses garlic, neem leaves, and cayenne. Not harmful to bees. I tested on a small patch last week. Less aphid damage, better yield." Rosa smiled, clearly proud. "He adjusted the formula after we lost 3 tomato rows to pests last summer. The commercial stuff made the kids cough, so he started researching." Javier looked up. "The soil tells you everything. You just have to listen. Most people don't." Keanu was struck again by the quiet brilliance here. These weren't stories you saw on the news. These weren't people making headlines. They were neighbors, workers, faces in the crowd. And they held knowledge that corporations would pay fortunes for. Next, Rosa led him toward a folding table beneath a patchwork canopy. There sat a slender woman with a lined face and bright, intelligent eyes. Several children sat cross-legged in front of her, their hands busy with small abacuses and hand-drawn math games. "This is Nia," Rosa said gently. "She was a math teacher in Sudan." Nia looked up and offered a soft nod. "Hello, I hope you don't mind if I continue." Keanu sat quietly, observing. "All right," Nia said to the kids. "If we have 5 garden beds and each has 6 rows, how many rows total?" One boy began counting on his fingers. 5 times 6. "Good," Nia said. "And if each row grows 3 tomato plants?" The children shouted different numbers. Nia waited, smiling. Then one girl stood and proudly announced, 90. "Excellent. Now, who wants to draw the planting grid?" Keanu leaned closer to Rosa. "Where did she get her materials?" "She made them," Rosa whispered. "She volunteers 3 afternoons a week. Most of these kids missed school for years because their families moved around too much. She brings stability." Nia finished her lesson and turned to Keanu. "Numbers are a language of patterns," she said simply. "When children see order, they feel safe." He nodded, suddenly feeling like a student instead of a guest. "You taught in Sudan?" "For 12 years. But I came here with nothing. Paperwork got lost, credentials weren't accepted. Now I clean hotel rooms." Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was anger at the system that could let this happen. He looked at the handmade posters taped to the tarp, simple multiplication charts, a fraction circle made from a paper plate, a calendar with planting days and harvest estimates. It was a makeshift classroom, but the joy in the kids' faces was real. "I can't believe I never knew this was here," Keanu said softly. Rosa glanced around at the others, then back at him. "Most people don't ask." From behind a table stacked with old laptops and charging cables, a soft voice said, "He's watching me." Everyone turned. A boy, maybe 14, sat in a second-hand wheelchair with a pillow tucked behind his back. He was dark-skinned, thin, with intelligent eyes that sparkled beneath thick glasses. A small sticker on his laptop read, "Teus Lab." Keanu stepped closer. "You mean?" Che nodded. "You've been glancing at my code for 10 minutes. Keanu chuckled. "I can't help it. What are you working on?" Tai rotated the screen to show a map of the garden, with colored dots scattered across it. "It's a soil moisture monitoring system. I built the sensors from old Arduino boards. See the green dots? Beds with ideal hydration. Yellow means borderline, red's too dry." Keanu blinked. "You coded this yourself?" Tai shrugged. "My uncle taught me the basics. The rest I picked up from YouTube and online forums." Rosa added softly, "Tai can't walk more than a few minutes at a time. His mother cleans houses all day and brings him here after school. This space is where he learns." Tai tapped another key. A new window opened. An animated chart comparing different garden beds' output over 3 seasons. "I started tracking everything last year," he said. "Rain patterns, pest activity, sunlight hours. I want to build a predictive model for crop rotation." Keanu knelt beside him. "You know how rare it is to think like this?" Tai looked away. "Teachers at school just give me crossword puzzles. They think that's all I can handle." "Not here," Rosa said firmly. "Here, we see him." Tai smiled faintly, then leaned forward. "I know who you are," he whispered. "You build rockets in movies. I like your bike, too. But this place, it's where real stuff happens." Keanu didn't know what to say. No red carpet or studio award had ever made him feel like this moment did. Seen, welcomed, changed. From the far end of the garden, an older man called out, "Rosa, the new irrigation line is clogged again." She waved back, "Coming." As she turned to leave, Keanu stood. "I want to help." She looked over her shoulder. "You sure? That mud gets deep." He nodded. "It's the first thing today that makes perfect sense." As they walked off toward the irrigation pipes, Keanu looked back one last time. Tai was already typing again, lips moving as he explained his logic to a younger girl beside him. Nia reset her abacus lesson. Javier carried another jar to a group testing compost mixtures. It hit Keanu then. This wasn't just a garden hidden behind buildings. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of lost potential finally being seen. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't want to fix anything. He wanted to learn. Keanu crouched beside Annabelle's tomato patch, the muddy ground still soft from the earlier rain. The girl's tiny fingers pointed proudly to a cluster of green tomatoes pushing through the vines. "These are going to be red in 2 weeks," she said confidently. "Maybe even sooner if the sun stays out." Keanu nodded, impressed. "They look strong." Annabelle tilted her head and said, "I'm going to grow tomatoes on the moon." Keanu blinked. "The moon?" She grinned. "Yup. Rosa says they grew food in space once. I saw it on YouTube. If we can grow tomatoes in dirt next to broken buildings, why not the moon?" Her logic was so simple it made him laugh softly. But it wasn't a childish dream. There was something deeply serious in her eyes. She wasn't joking. She believed it. "Dreams like that," he said, "are how real change begins." Annabelle beamed. "That's what Rosa says too. She says people laugh at big ideas until they come true." Keanu sat back, his jacket damp against the cinder block ledge of the shed. He watched as Annabelle ran to join a group of kids forming a watering brigade near the compost bin. Buckets clanked, laughter echoed through the alley walls. Rosa appeared beside him, a towel slung over her shoulder, a bit of soil smudged on her cheek. "She told you about the moon?" He chuckled. "She did." Rosa gave a half smile. "That girl's got more fight in her than most people I've met. Her mother works 2 jobs. They share a bedroom with 3 cousins. She still comes here every Thursday and talks about Mars and tomatoes like it's already happening. She reminds me of someone I used to be," Keanu said quietly. They stood there for a moment, watching the rhythm of a garden running like a heartbeat. Rosa eventually spoke again, her tone more guarded this time. "You don't have to come back, Mr. Reeves. The kids will understand. You've got your own world. This one's a little messy." Keanu turned toward her, sincerity etched across his face. "Messy is where the real things grow." She studied him for a moment, uncertain. "I'd like to come back," he added, "if that's okay." Rosa didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "Thursdays at 4, we always save a tamale or two." Keanu smiled. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. That night, back in the quiet of his Los Angeles home, Keanu stood at his kitchen sink, staring at the reflection of city lights dancing in the window. His dinner sat untouched. His laptop screen glowed softly from the counter. He opened a browser and typed, "Hydroponics in space." One article became 3, then 10. He dove into stories of astronauts growing lettuce aboard the ISS, studies on microgravity farming, urban food deserts. He clicked on a report titled "Vertical Gardening in High-Risk Communities." Then a video of a school in Detroit turning an abandoned gymnasium into a food-producing greenhouse. Another on how children's nutrition directly affects literacy rates. He kept reading. The night deepened. The clock ticked well past midnight. But something in him had already shifted. Keanu's eyes flicked across a research paper about aeroponic root misting systems used in lunar simulation labs. He barely noticed the time. He wasn't reading like a celebrity browsing trivia. He was studying like a man with a purpose. He paused when he reached a case study from New Mexico about using recycled gray water to feed rooftop gardens in low-income housing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't revolutionary, but it worked. He bookmarked it. Then another article, this one about a retired botanist teaching gardening to kids in a shelter. The photos reminded him of what he'd seen in that hidden alley. Dirt-streaked faces, little hands cradling fragile leaves, hope that grew under nails and didn't need permission to bloom. He opened a notepad and typed 3 words. Rosa. Annabelle. Resilience. His fingers hovered, then continued. He began outlining what he'd need to build a small vertical garden, just one to start. Materials, costs, light conditions. He didn't know if Rosa would even accept help, but somehow that didn't matter right now. The seed was planted. He switched tabs again. Another study, this one from NASA, suggested tomatoes were among the best crops for long-duration missions because of their short growth cycles and high nutritional density. He looked up, exhaled slowly, and whispered, "She really could grow them on the moon." It wasn't just a pretty thought. It was within reach. If someone cared enough to help build the bridge. The next morning, as the sun peeked into his kitchen, Keanu sipped black coffee and stared at a blank sketch pad on the table. It was meant for scripts or character studies, but today he wasn't thinking about movies. He drew rough outlines of stacked PVC towers, a way to grow more in less space. Not futuristic, just functional. Something simple that could fit behind an apartment building. Something the kids could maintain. Something Annabelle could own. He thought about how she'd knelt beside her tomato vines, hands in the soil like it was sacred. How Rosa had taught that boy in the wheelchair to test the pH of compost tea like a young scientist. It wasn't just gardening, it was dignity, power, education disguised as play, healing disguised as chores. He stood suddenly, grabbed the keys from his counter, and headed out the door. His destination wasn't a studio or a set, it was the hardware store. He walked the aisles with purpose, asking questions, taking notes. He left with seedling trays, food-safe buckets, a spool of irrigation tubing, and an idea that wouldn't leave him alone. As he loaded the bags into his trunk, his phone buzzed. It was a reminder for a script meeting that afternoon. He silenced it. Not today. He'd keep the appointment tomorrow, maybe. But today something else was calling. Later that evening, Rosa found a package on her porch. No note, Just a bag labeled "For the Moon Garden," filled with organic tomato seeds, small nutrient pouches, and a folder with simple drawings of vertical systems. She stared at it for a long time before calling her mother in Mexico. They spoke in quiet tones, part awe, part confusion, part disbelief. Then she tucked the folder into her bookshelf and whispered to herself, "He's serious." She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew the garden would never be the same. Thursday arrived with a soft morning mist hanging low over the city. Keanu Reeves stood outside the small corner market near the bus stop, a reusable tote slung over his shoulder. Inside were gardening gloves, packets of seeds he'd carefully chosen after hours of research, and a small notebook filled with notes about urban soil health. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He just showed up, dressed in jeans, an old gray t-shirt, and boots that had seen better days. When he reached the narrow alleyway between the cracked buildings, he paused. From the outside, nothing had changed. The garden still hid like a secret behind those crumbling walls. He stepped inside, heart quietly pounding. Rosa was already there, crouched near a bed of squash, her dark braid swinging behind her shoulder. A few kids were turning compost near the back, and an older man was repairing a trellis with string and wire. Keanu didn't call out. He just walked in slowly, head slightly bowed, waiting to be noticed. Zion, the boy in the wheelchair, spotted him first. "Hey," he said, squinting. "It's the movie guy." Heads turned, conversations paused. Even Rosa stood slowly, brushing her hands on her jeans, eyebrows lifted in surprise. "I came to help," Keanu said, lifting his tote and offering a quiet smile. Nobody responded right away. Then Annabelle piped up from the strawberry patch. "You brought seeds?" Keanu nodded. "Cherry tomatoes, basil, carrots. And I looked up soil pH levels last night. I think we can boost your bed yields with a little lime and compost rotation." Javier, the soft-spoken chemist turned janitor, raised an eyebrow with interest. "You did your homework," he muttered approvingly. Without waiting for permission, Keanu walked to the tool shed and pulled out a small shovel. He found a patch that looked unattended and started working, his motions unsure but genuine. The silence stretched, but no one told him to stop. Little by little, they returned to their tasks. He didn't ask to be introduced. He didn't make any speeches. He simply dug, loosened the soil, and listened. Zion wheeled up beside him after a while. "You know, that spot's good for basil. Gets just enough shade after 3. Keanu looked at the sky, then back at the boy. "Perfect," he said. "You mind showing me how you test the moisture?" The boy grinned and held up a makeshift gauge he'd rigged with help from Rosa. A hollowed-out marker tube filled with soil indicators. "Better than my science teachers," Zion boasted. She said so herself. Keanu knelt, hands caked with soil, nodding as the boy explained the tool in detail. He wasn't pretending. He was learning. Every word the child said, he treated with the gravity he gave to directors on set or investors in a boardroom. Meanwhile, Rosa watched from across the garden. She hadn't said a word. Her lips were tight, her eyes guarded. But she hadn't walked away either. She stood with her arms crossed, unsure of what to make of it. This man, this celebrity, was now kneeling in dirt beside children. Not performing, not posturing, just present. And that, perhaps, was more surprising than anything. By midday, Keanu had rotated compost, spread mulch with Annabelle, and helped repair a broken irrigation valve under Diego's supervision. He wasn't afraid to get muddy. When the hose burst and soaked the left side of his shirt, he only laughed and kept working. No one treated him like a celebrity anymore. They handed him buckets, called out questions about seed spacing, and asked him to move aside when he blocked the path. That, in itself, was a kind of welcome. Sophia, the fast food cashier who doubled as their pest control expert, handed him a small container of crushed garlic and chili. "Here," she said, "rub this around the base of your new tomato bed. It keeps ants off without harming the roots." Keanu took the jar carefully, sniffed it, and smiled. "Smells like determination." Sophia chuckled and walked off. Diego watched the exchange with folded arms. He didn't say much, but he noticed. So did Nia, the former math teacher, who kept glancing over from where she was helping two teens map out the garden's new planting calendar. Keanu wandered back to where Zion was finishing up notes in his gardening log. "You write all that down? Every week?" Keanu asked, peering over his shoulder. "Every Thursday." Zion nodded. "Moisture, sunlight hours, insect sightings, growth patterns. Helps me predict which crops will mature faster." "You ever think about being a scientist?" Keanu asked gently. "I already am," Zion replied, without looking up. Keanu didn't argue. He just smiled. "That you are." From behind the rosemary bush, Annabelle popped up. "Want to see the moon tomatoes?" He followed her to a patch she'd carefully weeded. "I made the sign myself," she said proudly, pointing to a cardboard label that read, "Moon tomatoes do not step." Keanu crouched beside her. The seedlings were tiny but strong. "You think they'll grow all the way to space?" "No," she said seriously. "But someday they will. When I get to build my garden dome on the moon." "You're going to be the first lunar farmer?" "Nope," Annabelle said confidently. "The second. The first is probably already practicing somewhere." Keanu laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Something about the way she believed so fully, so innocently, made the weight on his shoulders feel a little lighter. Behind him, Rosa was still watching. She hadn't approached. She hadn't smiled. But her expression was no longer suspicious. It was uncertain, curious. Finally, she walked over. "You're really here again?" Keanu wiped his hands on a towel and stood. "Yeah. I said I'd come back." She tilted her head. "Most people don't mean it." "I do." A pause stretched between them. He didn't fill it with excuses. He just waited. She nodded slowly. "Then you dig your own rose. Today." He grinned. "That's fair." From behind them, a small voice called out, "Miss Rosa, my cucumber has yellow leaves." Rosa turned immediately. "Let's go see," she said, motioning to Keanu. "You too. You're on cucumber duty." They walked across the garden together, Rosa pointing out pests, explaining leaf curl, demonstrating with care. Keanu listened. Not just to her words, but to the way the kids responded. They didn't just admire her. They trusted her. Every movement, every bit of advice was received like sunlight by a plant starved of warmth. And in that moment, Keanu understood. This place wasn't just about food. It was about believing things could grow again, even when the world said they couldn't. The sun filtered gently through the leaves as Keanu Reeves knelt beside a narrow trench, sleeves rolled up, gloved hands sunk into the damp soil. Across from him, Javier crouched on a wooden crate, a notebook balanced on one knee. Between them lay a tangle of pipes, fittings, and hand-drawn sketches that looked more like blueprints for a spaceship than a garden system. "Gravity is free," Javier said, tapping the diagram. "If we raise this collection barrel another foot, we can increase water pressure naturally, less reliance on the pump." Keanu nodded, absorbing the concept. "And it won't disturb the roots if we disperse the water gradually along the slope?" "Exactly," Javier replied. Slow-a-bill irrigation using reclaimed tubing. They were surrounded by scattered tools and curious children who occasionally peered in to offer suggestions or simply watched the duo at work. Nearby, Rosa worked with Mrs. Vasquez on compost sorting, but every so often she glanced in Keanu's direction, not with suspicion now, but something closer to wonder. Later that day, As lunch wound down beneath the patchy shade of a worn tarp, Annabelle approached Keanu carrying a bundle of tomatoes clutched in her small hands. "These are the 3 I've been saving," she said shyly. "One's from the rooftop pot, the other's from the shaded corner. Which tastes better?" Keanu chuckled gently, accepting the tomatoes like precious jewels. "That depends," he said. "Are we testing for sweetness or for interstellar survival?" Annabelle giggled. "Both." He bit into the first tomato. Sweet, bright, tender. The second had a tougher skin, more acidic but still good. The third, from the rooftop, was surprisingly robust, firm and tangy. He looked at Annabelle, who waited breathlessly. "The rooftop wins today," he declared, "but only just." "I told Rosa we needed more sun," Annabelle whispered triumphantly, then dashed off to tell the others. Keanu turned back toward Javier and picked up a length of hose. They resumed work, but it no longer felt like a favor he was doing. It felt like collaboration, mutual curiosity, like building something with people who still believed the world could grow. If you just gave it sunlight, water, and a little trust. That afternoon, Keanu found himself seated cross-legged near the compost shed, his sketchbook open across his lap. Lines and angles filled the page, ideas for vertical garden racks that could be mounted on rooftops or balconies. He shaded in water channels, labeled drainage paths, added modular trays for quick harvesting. Tay rolled over in his wheelchair, craning to see. "Those look like launch towers," he said, squinting. "But with vegetables." Keanu smiled. "Maybe they are. Just not for rockets this time. More for strawberries, kale, maybe mint." "Could we grow lettuce in space?" Tay asked. Keanu paused, pencil hovering. "We already have. NASA's been experimenting with that on the International Space Station. But they're limited by light, water, and gravity." Tay nodded thoughtfully. "What about here, like on rooftops? Could we use the same idea?" "That's what I'm hoping," Keanu replied, flipping to another page. "We test it here first. See what survives heat, wind, and drought, then adapt it to different places." Ty leaned closer, intrigued. "What if the trays rotated to follow the sun?" Keanu's eyes lit up. "That's a brilliant idea. Solar tracked beds." He began sketching again, this time adding a circular base beneath the towers. Tay beamed with pride, his hand twitching toward the page. "You should sign this design," Keanu said. "It's yours now, too." The boy hesitated. Then, carefully, with effort, wrote his name next to Keanu's. For a moment, it was just pencil and paper, but it felt like possibility. Later, Rosa approached Keanu while he was hammering together a new trellis. She stood with her arms folded, her eyes shaded with uncertainty. "You've been back every Thursday," she said quietly. "You're not just visiting." He set the hammer down and wiped sweat from his brow. "No. I'm not." "Why?" she asked, her voice caught between curiosity and caution. "Why are you really here, Keanu?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because this place," he said gently, "is the most human place I've been in years." Rosa didn't speak right away, but her expression softened, just a little, as if his words had pulled something from deep inside her, something tender, something true. That evening, as the golden sun dipped behind the buildings, the garden glowed with an almost magical warmth. Children chased each other between the planter beds. Laughter echoed as someone accidentally spilled compost on their shoes. Rosa sat beside an elderly woman shelling beans, and across from them, Keanu and Javier knelt by the irrigation lines. The old system was a maze of hoses patched with tape, split in places, tangled and inefficient. Javier explained how gravity-fed systems worked, how pressure built from elevation, how water could be stored in reused barrels and distributed evenly through sloped piping. Keanu nodded, listening closely. Then he grabbed a stick and began sketching directly into the soft dirt. "Here," he said, pointing. "If we reroute the runoff from the south roof into this corner, build a collection tank, then lift it about 5 feet on a secure frame, gravity will handle the rest. Fewer pumps, less noise, more efficient." Javier raised his eyebrows. "You understand hydraulics? Enough to stay humble." Keanu smiled. "And enough to know when someone else knows more." They worked into the fading light, testing flow rates with old bottles, marking points with bits of chalk on the concrete. Rosa watched from afar. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Annabelle came running with a crumpled sheet of paper in her hand. "Mr. Keanu, look! I drew it!" she shouted, waving the sketch with pride. "My tomato space garden." Keanu took the paper, smoothing it gently. The drawing was clumsy, but imaginative. Planters floated in bubbles above a moonscape. Tiny vines reached for light, and in the corner, a stick figure in a space helmet held a watering can. "It's perfect," he said. "But you forgot one thing." "What?" she asked, wide-eyed. He pointed to the figure. "You didn't draw yourself with a big smile." Annabelle giggled, grabbed a crayon from her pocket and added the grin. Keanu knelt beside her. "Keep dreaming, Annabelle, because dreams like this are where the best changes begin." At night, as the garden quieted and stars blinked overhead, Keanu lingered longer than usual. There was something sacred in the dirt beneath his fingers, something he couldn't yet name but knew he needed more of. The rain started as a whisper, a few soft drops tapping against the tarp roofs of the garden sheds. Then the wind shifted. Skies that had been overcast all morning darkened suddenly, like a curtain falling over the sun. Within minutes, the whisper turned into a roar. Keanu had been helping Rosa reposition a rain barrel when he felt a shift in pressure, the kind of subtle change that came before something powerful. He looked up just as the first sheet of rain came crashing down. Across the garden, children shrieked in surprise, scattering for cover. Javier shouted something in Spanish, trying to pull tarps over a section of fragile seedlings. Nia grabbed 2 of the smallest children by the hands and rushed them toward Mrs. Gonzalez's storage shed. The water came fast, faster than anyone had expected. Within 10 minutes, the center path was flooded. Wooden planks that served as walkways floated loose from their anchors, drifting like lost rafts. Compost bins toppled, seed trays overturned, their contents washing into the mud. Rows of greens bent under the weight of the downpour until they collapsed entirely. Keanu, soaked through, helped move the last of the kids into shelter. Then he turned and saw Rosa. She stood knee-deep in water, staring at a ruined planting bed. Her shoulders trembled. At first, he thought she was just cold. But then he saw her hands move to her face, and when she dropped to her knees in the mud, something inside him twisted. He ran to her. The raised bed in front of her had been completely flattened, stalks broken, leaves torn, tomatoes washed into the dirt. It had been Annabelle's pride, the spot she returned to first every Thursday, the place where she whispered secrets to her plants and dreamed of the moon. Now it was just brown water and broken stems. Rosa didn't speak. She just knelt there, motionless, her hands in the mud as though trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. The others gave her space. They knew what this moment was. All their work, all the Saturdays hauling soil, the late nights watering by flashlight, the planning meetings over warm tamales, it was all in that bed. And now it was gone. Keanu knelt beside her slowly. His hands joined hers in the ruined soil, not to fix, not to clean, just to be there, beside her. The rain kept falling. And then, in a low voice, Keanu said, "Then we rebuild, stronger." Rosa didn't respond, not at first, but her shoulders stopped shaking. A breath escaped her. somewhere between a sob and a sigh. Not because the pain had passed, but because someone had chosen to share it. She nodded once, barely visible through the curtain of rain. And they stayed like that, side by side, hands in the broken earth as the garden wept around them. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the damage had already carved its mark. The garden was unrecognizable. Where neat rows once stood were now patches of thick brown muck. Waterlogged beds leaned like broken ribs. The painted signs the kids had made for the carrots and kale lay splintered against the fence. The compost pile had split open, spilling half-decomposed scraps across the walkways. Keanu arrived before anyone else. He had barely slept, his body ached from the cold, but he was determined. He walked through the garden slowly, mud pulling at his boots. His eyes scanned everything, the collapsed trellises, the torn vines, the floating plastic containers, and he took it all in without flinching. One by one, others arrived. Javier shook his head silently and walked to what had been the irrigation corner. He picked up a broken pipe, studied the fracture, and laid it gently on a bench. Naya sat down near the entrance, holding the soaked remains of a notebook where the kids had tracked plant growth and weather patterns. A few of the children hovered by the fence, unsure whether they were allowed to enter what had become a ruin. Then Rosa arrived. She stood at the gate, holding Annabelle's hand. The girl looked up at her, uncertain. Rosa gave her a small nod. Annabelle stepped forward. She didn't cry, not yet, but when she saw the bare patch where her tomato bed had been, her chest rose sharply, and her lips pressed together hard. She moved closer and knelt just like Rosa had the night before. She named them, Rosa said softly to Keanu, who stood nearby. Each tomato, each one had a name. Keanu swallowed hard. Annabelle reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small plastic container. Inside were 5 seeds, dry, untouched. "I saved some," she whispered, "in case something bad ever happened." Keanu dropped to one knee beside her. "That's what real gardeners do," she nodded solemnly. The quiet was broken by Marco arriving in his wheelchair, his tires struggling through the wet gravel. When he saw the damage, his face fell. "The water monitor," he said. "It got fried. I forgot to unplug it." "We can build another one," Keanu told him. "Maybe a better version this time." Others began to gather closer now, drawn by the unspoken truth that silence had passed and something else was needed. Action, healing, purpose. Mrs. Gonzalez walked through the back gate, holding a tray of hot tortillas. She set them down on the dry table under the lone surviving canopy. "We're still here," she said quietly. "That has to count for something." Rosa nodded slowly, as if waking from a long grief. Keanu turned to the group. "Let's make today about 2 things: saving what we can, and imagining what this place could become next." The cleanup began not with shovels, but with hands, bare, gloved, young, and weathered. Keanu helped Marco build ramps of plywood so his chair could move over the softer mud. Javier gathered the scattered compost and covered it with fresh mulch, already thinking about how to improve drainage next season. Rosa, silent but focused, carefully salvaged the seedling trays, separating the living from the drowned. Annabelle and Nia used old spoons to rescue worms and ladybugs from puddles. The laughter that followed was small, but real. Healing had started. Keanu stepped back for a moment and looked at them all, covered in mud, surrounded by chaos, but working side by side. It wasn't just a garden being rebuilt. It was dignity, hope, and maybe something even more. Rosa approached quietly, her hands still caked in soil. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him. Keanu met her eyes. "Because this is the most human place I've been in years." The words landed softly between them. She said nothing, only gave a quiet nod, then turned back toward the garden. The sun broke through the clouds just then, striking the mud with a soft light. It was the beginning of something new. That night, Keanu didn't sleep. The memory of Annabelle's tears clung to him, her small shoulders shaking as she looked out over the destroyed garden. The way Rosa's hands trembled as she sifted through waterlogged roots. The look on Javier's face. Quiet, stoic, but broken. He sat alone at his kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. His fingers moved over a sketch pad, the same kind he used during early set designs and motorcycle mods. But tonight, it wasn't about cameras or engines. It was about saving a garden. He drew the outline of the lot from memory. Then he layered in the elevation slope, remembering how water had pooled from the east end. He scribbled, erased, redrew. By dawn, the page was covered in ideas. Raised garden beds, elevated from ground level with flood-proof legs. A perimeter trench to divert rainwater into filtered barrels. Solar panels to power basic irrigation. A greenhouse, modular, simple, affordable. And in the center, a learning space. He didn't know how it would all come together, not yet. But he knew who to ask. By 7 a.m., he was on the phone with a friend from his documentary project on renewable cities, then another from a sustainable farm in Oregon. By noon, he'd assembled a tiny team: architects, water engineers, designers, and 2 passionate community growers. None of them hesitated when he asked for help. That night, they all gathered in his garage. Tables were covered with laptops, printouts, coffee mugs, and measuring tapes. The air smelled like sawdust and ambition. Javier came too, hesitant at first, then slowly pulled into the energy of it all. He stood shoulder to shoulder with a retired NASA systems engineer as they debated rainflow angles. Rosa arrived late and lingered in the corner, arms crossed, unsure. Keanu walked over and offered her a folded blueprint. "It's not perfect," he said, "but I want your opinion before anyone else's." She opened the paper, eyes scanning the sketched greenhouse structure. Her lips pressed into a tight line, unreadable. Then, very softly, she nodded. "You need ventilation here," she murmured, pointing to a section near the seedling trays. "Otherwise, mold will spread fast during the winter months." A pause. Then she looked up at him. "But it's good." Keanu smiled, more relieved than he expected to be. "Then we keep going," he said. And they did, together, into the night. By the following Thursday, word had quietly spread. The garden was still unusable, waterlogged and muddy, but a nearby church opened its basement for a special meeting. Folding chairs lined up beneath humming fluorescent lights. The smell of damp soil still clung to everyone's clothes. Some came curious. Others came because Keanu Reeves had promised he'd return with an idea. Rosa stood near the back, silent, watching, her expression unreadable. Javier set up a small projector while Keanu and the team carefully unrolled blueprints across the long table at the front. Keanu took a breath. Then he began. "We can't undo what the storm did," he said, "but maybe we can build something that's stronger because of it." He stepped aside so the projector could light up the first slide. A sketch of the new garden filled the wall. Raised planting beds, transparent greenhouse panels, a shaded seating area for the elders, a water reclamation trench along the outer border, solar-powered lights for evening classes, rain barrels, tool sheds on stilts, and tucked in one corner, a modest tech station powered by a solar inverter where kids could do homework. Whispers passed through the room. Keanu glanced at Annabelle sitting in the second row, her small hand holding on to Rosa's. He smiled at her, then pointed to a smaller blueprint pinned to the side. "These are the tomato towers. We'll make them higher with drainage systems. Each child can have one of their own, and if we're smart about the materials, they'll last years." A man in his 50s, someone Keanu hadn't met, raised his hand slowly. "But who's going to build this?" he asked. "We don't have money for all that." Javier answered before Keanu could. We already have designs, we just need time and hands. Some supplies are being donated. Keanu's covering what we can't get. Another woman asked cautiously, "What about city permits?" Keanu nodded. "Already in motion. One of my friends is a legal advocate for urban renewal projects. We'll handle the paperwork." Still, silence settled for a beat. Then Rosa stood up. "I was skeptical too," she said, her voice clear. "I didn't ask for this. None of us did. But what we've built isn't just a garden. It's survival. It's dignity." She glanced at Keanu. "And if someone wants to help us rebuild it the right way, we should listen." That was the moment the mood shifted. A young mother raised her hand and said she could bring construction tools from her brother. A high school boy offered to translate the plans into Spanish for the older neighbors. Tewei, the boy with the laptop, raised his phone and said he'd start organizing volunteer shifts online. Hope stirred like seedlings after rain. Keanu looked around the room and felt it in his chest. Quiet, but real. They weren't just agreeing to build something. They were deciding to believe again. After the meeting, no one left quickly. Small groups lingered in the church basement, huddled around the blueprints. There was an energy in the air, cautious but undeniable. Even those who had sat silently through the presentation were now leaning in, asking questions, tracing garden paths with their fingers. Keanu stayed behind, helping pack up the designs with Javier, Rosa, and 2 high school volunteers who had offered to scan the papers into PDFs. Annabelle stayed close to Rosa's side. She hadn't said much, but her eyes kept flicking to the tomato tower sketches with growing curiosity. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The streetlights reflected in the wet asphalt, turning the sidewalk into a glimmering ribbon of possibility. "You think we can really do it?" Javier asked as they stepped into the evening air. Keanu paused. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think we have to try." A voice behind them chimed in. "I think we will." It was Rosa. She held the door open for the last few people trickling out, her arms crossed, eyes still wary, but her voice had no hesitation. "For years, we've tried to stay small," she continued, "so we wouldn't lose what we had. Now, maybe it's time to grow." Keanu looked at her with quiet respect. "You're not afraid?" She exhaled slowly. "I'm always afraid, but I'm more afraid of these kids thinking the world will never fight for them." That night, back in his home, Keanu sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, flipping through photos on his phone. Images of the garden before the flood, Taye laughing as he showed off his coding project, Annabelle pointing proudly to her tomato plant, Rosa kneeling beside a broken hose, patching it with duct tape. He stopped on one image, Javier crouched beside a compost bin, surrounded by 3 children, hanging on to every word as he explained the layers of green and brown material. Keanu stared at the screen for a long time. These people had built something extraordinary out of nothing. No funding, no fame, no help. Just commitment, just care. And they had done it in a city that barely saw them. He opened a notebook and wrote down a single sentence. "The most innovative people in this city aren't in boardrooms, they're in backlots." He underlined it twice. The following morning, Keanu sent a message to his friend Miles, a systems engineer who had worked on disaster-resilient shelters in the Gulf Coast. Within hours, they were on a call with a structural designer and a sustainable agriculture expert from UCLA. Keanu explained what he'd seen, what they wanted to build, what the garden meant. No one asked why he was doing this. They could hear it in his voice. That afternoon, Keanu walked into a hardware store near East Hollywood with a list of supplies, not as a celebrity, just as a man with a mission. 2 employees recognized him and froze. Keanu gave a small wave, picked up a cart, and went straight to the aisle with irrigation piping. By the time he left, his truck was loaded with shovels, stakes, wood panels, water barrels, and seed trays. He drove straight to the church basement, where Rosa and several community members had already set up a temporary planning center. Folding tables held piles of salvaged materials, Volunteers sorted through bins of seed packets and broken tools, assessing what could be saved. When Keanu arrived with the first load, the room went silent for a beat. Then applause broke out. He blushed, ducking his head, and said simply, "There's more in the truck." No one questioned him anymore, not even Rosa. That evening, under the yellow glow of hanging work lamps, the new plan moved forward. Everyone had a role. Annabelle and the kids would decorate the new seed trays with paint and chalk. Tay would help build a basic scheduling app so volunteers could track shifts and deliveries. Favi and Keanu would start assembling a test rig for the improved irrigation system in Rosa's backyard. And Rosa, quiet, strong Rosa, would teach soil science to anyone willing to listen. The storm had torn through their garden. But in its wake, something stronger was taking root. Something that couldn't be washed away. Not this time. The morning Keanu Reeves walked into the office of Monarch Urban Holdings, he wasn't dressed like a movie star or a billionaire. No entourage, no press. Just a man in jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and mud-stained boots. He had come straight from the garden site, still raw from the storm, still fresh with resolve. He'd done his homework. The land wasn't public. It was privately owned by Monarch, a luxury development firm with plans to replace the block with high-rise condos and boutique retail. Keanu wasn't interested in a fight. He wanted a solution. So he requested a meeting. The CEO, Vincent Blair, didn't hide his disdain. He barely looked up from his espresso as Keanu entered the glass-walled office. The city's skyline sparkled behind him, but the air in the room felt cold. "Mr. Reeves," Vincent said flatly, motioning without interest toward a seat. "To what do I owe the honor? Another charity stunt for the cameras?" Keanu sat without reacting to the jab. "I'd like to make an offer on the lot near Ortega and 5th, the one behind the Vasquez apartments." Blair's eyebrows lifted. "The dirt lot? You mean the one we're developing into 26 luxury units and 2 rooftop lounges?" Keanu nodded. "It's currently vacant. I'll offer double the market value." Blair chuckled, clearly amused. "Let me get this straight. You want to buy prime real estate in the fastest growing part of the city so you can grow tomatoes and build rain barrels?" Keanu didn't smile. "So the community can, and the children there can keep learning. The storm wiped out the garden, but they've built something worth saving." Blair leaned back in his chair. "Look, I admire your heart, but this isn't a charity zone. This is development, real money, real projects. Condos are what the city wants, not some sentimental vegetable patch." "And if the city disagrees?" Keanu asked. Blair's smile vanished. Keanu stood slowly. "I hoped this would be easy, but if it's not, I'll go another route." Blair waved him off. "You're a good actor, Mr. Reeves, but you're not going to win this one." Without another word, Keanu left. Outside, the city felt noisier, faster, but in his chest, something had gone quiet, focused. Keanu didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the small kitchen of his home, his fingers wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, replaying every word from the meeting. The arrogance in Blair's tone, the way he'd dismissed the garden, the way he'd spoken about people as if they were nothing more than obstacles in the way of profit. Keanu knew that feeling all too well. He had seen it on film sets, in boardrooms, and in life. People like Rosa, Javier, and Annabelle, people with heart, rarely got heard. That was about to change. The next morning, Keanu walked into his publicist's office holding a folder filled with photographs, garden sketches, and stories. He asked for one simple thing: time on his own platform. 2 days later, a video was posted to Keanu's official social media pages. No music, no editing, just him, standing in the muddy remains of the garden. "This place," he said into the camera, "was built by people the world ignores. Scientists, teachers, engineers. They worked night shifts, clean our homes, and take buses across the city. But here, in this patch of soil, they created something extraordinary. He stepped aside, revealing Rosa showing children how to plant again, Javier adjusting makeshift irrigation lines, Marco, the boy in the wheelchair, entering notes on a tablet. This isn't about land, Keanu continued. It's about potential, and someone wants to pave over it for profit. He ended simply. If you think this garden matters, if you believe in giving people a chance, help us keep it alive. Within hours, the video went viral. People across the country watched as Keanu Reeves, the beloved star known for avoiding the spotlight, stood ankle-deep in mud to defend a forgotten neighborhood. The comment sections exploded with emotion. Parents shared how the video reminded them of their childhoods. Teachers reposted the story, calling it a masterclass in grassroots education. Celebrities began sharing the video, tagging the city council. News stations picked up the story that night. Headlines read, "Keanu Reeves fights to save community garden," and "Hollywood star takes on luxury developer." Vincent Blair hadn't expected this. Monarch Urban Holdings was suddenly facing a PR storm of their own, and Keanu had only just begun. By Friday morning, the garden had become a symbol far larger than the plot of land itself. National morning shows invited Keanu to speak live. He declined, instead sending a short clip recorded from the garden. In it, he simply said, "This is not my story. It belongs to the people who never had a microphone until now." He passed the camera to Rosa, who shared how they built the garden, bed by bed, with donated lumber and borrowed tools. Then to Javier, who explained how his background in chemistry helped them purify water. Then to Annabelle, who held up her rebuilt tomato plant and whispered, "We're not giving up." That 3-minute clip reached 10 million views in less than a day. Soon, students began organizing in support. Schools as far away as Chicago and Atlanta sent letters to Los Angeles officials. Children held signs that read, "Let her tomatoes grow," and "Gardens over condos." A teacher in San Francisco organized a Grow for Good week, where kids learned about urban farming and wrote letters to the city zoning board. Behind the scenes, Keanu's legal team quietly filed for a temporary development injunction. The argument? The land in question met the requirements for a historical community zone under a little-used clause in local housing policy. They argued that the garden's impact, community involvement, and cultural value warranted protection. Blair responded publicly the next day in a press release. Accountants who work in mechanical glass defend. "Mr. Reeves is welcome to fund his own projects, but we do not conduct business based on emotional blackmail. Monarch Urban Holdings will proceed with its development plans as approved." That only made things worse. Rosa, who had remained quiet for most of the attention, finally spoke up at a local town hall meeting. Her voice shook as she said, "We didn't ask for fame. We asked for a patch of earth to grow hope. If that's too much to ask, then maybe we're asking the wrong people." The room erupted in applause. Keanu stood in the back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But inside, he felt something shift. This wasn't just about buying land anymore. It was about drawing a line, saying clearly and firmly that dignity couldn't be bulldozed, and that some roots, once planted, would grow through concrete. The news broke quietly at first. A short interview clip of Keanu Reeves on a late-night talk show. The host, mid-conversation, asked him what he'd been working on outside of acting. Keanu paused. Then, with that calm, deliberate tone the world knew so well, he said, "I've started something called the Hidden Talents Fund. It's a foundation that supports people whose gifts go unnoticed, people who should be scientists, teachers, engineers, but who are cleaning houses or working night shifts because the world didn't see them. I want to help them be seen." The clip went viral overnight. By morning, hashtags like Hidden Talents and Keanu's Fund were trending across platforms. But behind the sudden media buzz was months of planning, countless conversations, and one garden that changed everything. What began as a storm-wrecked patch of soil had grown into something much deeper. Keanu sat at a weathered picnic table inside the rebuilt garden's learning center. Beside him were Rosa Mendoza, now officially titled Executive Director of the Hidden Talents Fund, and Dr. Henry Lim, a quiet neuroscientist who had left his prestigious university post to help run the foundation's strategy team. A small whiteboard behind them displayed today's agenda: 3 grant review cases, 2 mentorship matches, and a site visit to a tech startup founded by a former refugee. Rosa wore the same determined look she had back in the early garden days, except now, her name sat atop official paperwork. Her office had walls instead of tarps. And her daily work? Overseeing millions of dollars in funding to provide scholarships, training, and employment for people like Javier, who had finally returned to chemistry. Javier now worked in a small but fully equipped laboratory funded by the foundation, researching sustainable soil treatments for urban agriculture. His joy was quiet, but it radiated through every report he submitted. He often dropped by the garden after work to test samples or share findings with the kids. Across town, Tay sat in front of a glowing laptop, surrounded by code. The teen had been awarded one of the fund's first tech innovation grants, which included a new computer, mentorship from a Google engineer, and access to advanced programming courses. He didn't speak much about the past, but his future? It was wide open now. He was designing an app that helped people with mobility impairments control garden tools using voice commands. When Keanu received Tay's prototype video, a simple clip of a robotic trowel moving on voice command, he smiled. "This," he whispered to himself, "is exactly what I hoped we'd grow." Keanu didn't want the foundation to be about charity. He made that clear from the beginning. This wasn't about rescue, it was about recognition. The world doesn't lack talent, he often said in meetings. It lacks access. One of the fund's first major programs was called From Labor to Legacy. It was created for immigrants, refugees, and formerly incarcerated individuals who had once trained in science, education, or skilled trades, but whose credentials were no longer valid or never recognized to begin with. The program matched them with local employers, paid for recertification, and even offered stipends while they studied. Rosa had helped design it personally. It was in that program that Nia found her way back to a classroom. Once a math teacher in Eritrea, she had been working the night shift at a laundromat. Now she was teaching algebra at a public middle school not far from the garden. Her students adored her. Her colleagues said she brought the patience of someone who knew what it meant to wait years for a second chance. The fund also invested in infrastructure. Keanu and his team partnered with local nonprofits to build more resilient gardens, like the one that started it all. Storm-proof structures with raised beds, filtered rainwater systems, and integrated learning spaces. These gardens weren't just for food. They were for learning, healing, belonging. One of the newest gardens had opened in Oakland. Another was underway in Detroit. Each site was co-managed by local residents, funded by the Hidden Talents Fund, and operated with the same spirit as Rosa's first patch of soil behind the apartment buildings. Keanu visited every site personally, quietly. No cameras, just a pair of gloves and a few hours digging, planting, or listening. At the end of each visit, he'd say the same thing. "Let me know what you need to grow. We'll find a way." By the time summer arrived, the fund had supported over 300 individuals across 5 states. The numbers were growing, but what mattered more were the names. People who had been invisible now had roles, purpose, and a future that looked like them. Tay's transformation was one of the most talked about in the community. With Rosa's encouragement and a small grant from the Hidden Talents Fund, he had entered an online accelerator program for teen coders with disabilities. He didn't just pass, he placed in the top 5 nationally. His project? A voice-controlled garden monitoring system that helped mobility-impaired users track soil moisture, light exposure, and temperature using only a tablet and simple commands. He named it Bloom. Keanu smiled the first time he watched Tay demonstrate it to a group of middle schoolers. The boy who once sat silent in the corner of the garden now stood confidently in front of a crowd, explaining software logic and user accessibility with ease. And then there was Rosa. Officially named the director of the Hidden Talents Fund, she now led a growing team of researchers, organizers, and educators. Her business card still felt strange in her hand. After all, she'd spent over a decade cleaning houses where no one asked for her name. But now she stood in conference rooms, testifying to city councils, helping design the future of inclusive community systems, and every Thursday, no matter what, she still went back to the garden. It reminded her of why she started. That Thursday evening, Keanu returned too. He and Rosa stood side by side, watching Annabelle run between rows of tomato plants, her laughter echoing under the low-hanging glow of solar lights. "Still wants to grow food on the moon," Rosa said with a quiet chuckle. Keanu nodded, eyes soft. "Then we'd better help her build the rocket." Around them, the garden hummed with quiet purpose. It was more than soil now. It was proof of potential, of dignity, of what happens when someone believes you're worth investing in. The sun was already high when Keanu pulled up in his dusty truck, its bed stacked with gardening supplies, fresh tools, and one final surprise. It had been 6 months since the flood that nearly ended everything. 6 months since the first sketch of an impossible idea. Now, on the corner of Jefferson and Sycamore, what once was an empty lot choked with concrete debris had transformed into something breathtaking. The new garden was bigger, smarter, curved. Beds lined the perimeter, elevated just enough to drain heavy rains, but low enough for children to climb in and explore. Solar panels framed the rear fence, powering the new greenhouse that shimmered in the morning light. Hanging planters danced gently in the breeze, spilling lettuce, strawberries, mint. A sign at the gate read, "Resilience Garden, where every seed matters." Keanu stepped through the gate and was immediately met by laughter. Kids darted through the paths, many of them barefoot, kicking up bits of soil. Annabelle stood near the center planter, her curls bouncing with every step as she gave directions like a tiny general. "No, the compost goes in that bin, not next to the kale. We talked about this," she scolded gently. When she spotted him, her eyes lit up. "Mr. Keanu," she shouted, waving both arms. "Come here. I have to show you something." He smiled and followed her to a circular raised bed painted in bold red and gold streaks. "This one's mine," she said proudly, hands on hips. "See those?" She pointed to tall, thick tomato vines wrapped around a metal spiral structure. "These are Martian tomatoes." Keanu knelt beside her. "Martian tomatoes, huh?" She nodded. "They're bred for hard conditions. Short stems, dense roots, small fruit but packed with flavor. Javier helped me choose the variety, and Rosa helped me map the nutrients. I've been tracking the sun angles myself." "You built a space-grade tomato station?" Keanu said, genuinely impressed. Annabelle grinned. "Told you I would." He smiled. "We're going to need someone to teach astronauts how to grow these when the first shuttle heads out." "Already packed my boots," she said, trying to look serious but failing to hold back a giggle. They both laughed, and behind them a small crowd of garden members gathered quietly, watching the moment with soft smiles and eyes full of something more powerful than pride. The air smelled of basil and fresh earth, the kind of scent you only find in places where people work with their hands and hearts. Nearby, Rosa stood with her clipboard, organizing the volunteers who would guide the afternoon tours. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes moved constantly, tracking progress, checking corners, quietly proud. She caught Keanu's gaze for a moment and gave him the smallest of nods. It said everything. Javier was inside the greenhouse, adjusting the automatic irrigation timer. He looked up when Keanu stepped in. "Still a little off on the morning cycle," he said, pointing to a data screen. "But I'll calibrate it this week. Plants don't like too much pampering." Keanu laughed softly. "Neither do people, I guess." Javier chuckled. "You'd be surprised." Across the walkway, Tay sat at the new digital learning station, surrounded by a group of younger kids. He had a garden app open on one side of the screen, a block-based programming tool on the other. "Okay," he said, raising his voice a bit so everyone could hear. "If we want to calculate the average yield per square foot, we need to input your data from last week." The kids typed in their numbers with wide-eyed focus. One girl whispered, "I didn't think math could grow food." Taya grinned. "Math grows everything." Keanu watched the scene in silence, overwhelmed by how much had changed and how much hadn't. The soil was new, the tools were better, the designs smarter. But the magic wasn't in the upgrades, it was in the people. The same hands that once dug into flooded beds were now teaching others to grow and code and lead. David Thompson walked over, arms crossed but eyes soft. "Didn't think we'd pull it off, did you?" Keanu shook his head. "I hoped, but I wasn't sure." David gave him a sideways glance. "Takes more than plans and money, takes roots." Keanu looked around at the raised beds, the greenhouse, the digital corner, then back at the community that built it all. "You've got deep ones," he said. A bell rang near the gate. Rosa's voice carried over the garden. "Everyone, it's time." It was the official opening, the moment they'd all worked toward. And as the gate swung open for the first public visitors, something shifted. Not just in the garden, but in all of them. Annabelle took Keanu's hand and tugged him toward her planter. "Come on, I saved the best for last," she said, her small voice bursting with excitement. Her section was slightly elevated, built just the right height for kids to tend without crouching. It was covered with a translucent dome that opened with a crank. Inside, nestled in neat rows, were lush green vines. Fat, blushing red tomatoes hung from them like ornaments. Keanu knelt beside her. "They made it," he whispered. Annabelle beamed. "Told you, these are the Mars ones. I named the best one Luna. Want a taste?" He nodded. With careful hands, she twisted off the ripest tomato and handed it to him. Keanu bit into it slowly, the juice running over his fingers. His eyebrows lifted. "That's incredible," he said, genuinely surprised. "How did you make it taste like sunshine?" Annabelle shrugged. "I sing to them." He smiled. "Of course you do." Behind them, a crowd was gathering. Neighbors, students, families, press. Rosa walked over to join them, standing behind Annabelle, her hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. She never missed a Thursday," Rosa said softly. "Even when we lost everything." Keanu stood and looked around at the people gathered, their faces filled with pride, relief, and something deeper, a sense of belonging, of victory, of proof. He turned to the group. "I don't have a speech, but I want to say something." The crowd quieted. "I've been in rooms with kings, actors, scientists, but none of them taught me what this community did. You reminded me that the most powerful force in the world is when people care." He glanced at Annabelle. "When people believe." There was a moment of silence. Then a hand started clapping. Then another. And suddenly the garden was alive with applause. Not loud or forced, but steady, grounded, like a heartbeat. Annabelle looked up. "So, do I still get to go to Mars?" Keanu knelt again and said, "We'll need someone to teach the crew how to grow tomatoes." She gasped. "Really?" He grinned. "And I'll be first in line to eat them." Laughter rippled through the garden. But there were tears too, because in that moment everyone knew This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of something even bigger. Keanu stood at the edge of the garden, watching the children as they darted between raised beds, their laughter mingling with the soft rustling of tomato leaves and sunflowers. The sunlight glinted off the greenhouse windows, casting golden reflections across the compost station, the solar panel frames, and the new water collection tanks that now stood like quiet guardians. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of soil, basil, and promise. This place had grown into something far greater than he'd imagined, and so had he. Later that evening, he opened his leather-bound journal, the one he rarely showed anyone. The pages were filled with quiet thoughts he scribbled in between sets, on movie shoots, on flights, or in moments when fame felt too loud. He flipped past pages marked with grief, loneliness, and wondering where he truly belonged. Then he came to the entry he had written after the storm, the moment that changed everything. He picked up a pen and began to write again. "I thought I was following a mystery," he wrote slowly, "but I was really following a calling, a quiet voice that wasn't mine, but maybe was meant for me all along." He paused, his mind drifting back to Annabelle's face when she first pointed at him in the rain, to Rosa's hands trembling as she placed a ruined seedling into his palm, to Tay's notebook filled with code scribbles and impossible ideas. None of them had ever asked him to save them. They just wanted someone to believe what they built mattered. He looked out his window at the stars. Somewhere up there, humanity dreamed of a future among the stars. But down here, he'd finally seen the kind of brilliance that wasn't on stages or red carpets or in boardrooms. It was in a tiny garden built from scrap wood and stubborn hope. It was in the hands of people who refused to disappear. Then he turned a new page and wrote something for the world. "If you're listening," he wrote, "maybe this story isn't really mine. Maybe it's yours. Have you ever overlooked someone's quiet brilliance? Have you ever hidden a talent because the world told you it didn't matter?" He tapped the pen once against the paper, then underlined the last question. The silence in the room was full, not empty. Then came the final lines. "Don't wait for permission to bloom. Grow anyway." He closed the journal, but the words stayed with him. The next morning, Keanu returned to the garden with no cameras, no assistants, no script. Just a watering can in one hand and a small seedling in the other. Rosa greeted him at the gate, her face brighter than usual. She had been up early, preparing herbal tea for the elders. Javier was already explaining aquaponic systems to a group of teens. Tay sat under the shade of the mango tree, walking a younger child through code logic on a shared laptop. Annabelle was elbow-deep in mulch, humming. Keanu smiled and knelt beside her. "Mission to Mars still on?" he asked gently. "Tomatoes don't quit." She grinned, brushing her forehead with the back of her hand. Neither did they. That evening, Keanu recorded a short message and posted it online. Not as a celebrity, but as someone who had finally learned how to listen. It was raw, simple, and from the heart. "Sometimes," he said softly into the camera, "we think we know the value of someone based on what we see. But I followed a quiet woman one Thursday and found a world that changed me." He let the silence sit for a moment. There are so many Rosa Mendozas out there. So many Javiers, so many Tays and Annabelles. Hidden talents, gifts buried under survival. But they're still growing, still dreaming. Then, he asked, have you ever seen someone the world overlooked, but you knew they were brilliant? Have you ever hidden a part of yourself because you were told it wouldn't matter? Tell me. Tell each other. Let's bring those voices into the light. He looked down, then back up. What hidden story should I find next? What quiet brilliance should we share together? The post went live that night. By morning, tens of thousands had commented. Veterans who never shared their poetry, refugees who built secret apps, grandmothers who taught science in war zones, high school dropouts who coded in basements. Thousands of voices, unheard until now. and somewhere among them a girl named Annabelle typed, "Tomatoes on Mars." One day, a small heart emoji followed, and Keanu smiled, knowing her dream had already taken root.